great news. Our keynote speaker here now. I've already introduced her. Her talk is going to be amazing. Woo.
Thank you so much. I hope you're referring to me.
Yes. Yes, Dr. Stancic, you're on.
All right, thank you, Mike. Sorry for the mix-up at the start here. I wish I was in Naples with you. I'm going to jump right in because we've lost a little bit of time. I always like to begin my presentations with a personal introduction, so we'll start there. My name is Saray Stancic, and I have been a physician over 28 years now. By training, I'm an internist and an infectious disease specialist, a field I became deeply interested in as a young medical student. You see, I went to medical school in Newark, New Jersey in the late 80s, and regrettably, that period was coincident with the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And as you might imagine, within that experience, I witnessed unspeakable human suffering and loss, and I wanted to be part of that solution. So when I completed my chief resident year in internal medicine, I went on to a fellowship in infectious diseases. Now, I have to tell you, I'm so proud of the work that I did in the field of infectious diseases over more than 28 years, not only in patient care, but also in research and helping to develop better treatments for those affected. But today, I no longer practice infectious diseases. Today, I am a passionate advocate of plant-based nutrition as a modality to help prevent, better manage, and even reverse disease. But the logical question you may have for me is, how in the world does an infectious disease physician with the background that I just described to you evolve into a passionate advocate and practitioner of plant-based nutrition? Well, in order for me to answer that question effectively, I need to share with you two separate experiences that occurred in my life that have shaped who I am today. One of them is a personal experience and the other a professional one. I'd like to begin with my personal story. And for that, I'm going to take you back to October 11th, 1995. On this day, I was a third-year medical resident and I was on call at Beth Israel Medical Center. I was working that 24-hour shift, and boy, was it ever busy. I was running for the emergency room and back to the general ward to the ICU all night, literally running. And it wasn't until around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning where I finally found an opportunity to make it back to my on-call room. I remember making my way there and feeling so deeply fatigued, something I had never experienced before. The minute my head hit that pillow, lights out. Shortly thereafter, as you might imagine, in the midst of that very busy call, I was paged yet again to address another urgent matter. But this time, when I tried to get up out of that sleeping position, an extraordinary thing happened. I couldn't feel my legs. I remember reaching down to touch them and they felt as if they were someone else's. Panic set in, and next thing I recalled, I was in the emergency room undergoing an MRI of my brain and spinal cord. And those studies confirmed a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis with multiple lesions in both my brain and spinal cord. And so just like that, everything changed. I was no longer that young, vibrant, healthy physician that had walked through the hospital doors earlier that morning, or at least I thought I was. I was now a chronic illness patient admitted to the hospital. And with that came what I call the era of drug dependency as the parade of pharmaceuticals marched into my life. I was immediately started on IV steroids to treat that acute event, and then multiple medicines to treat my now failing bladder, peripheral neuropathy, spasticity, and pain. I was discharged after 5 days and told to come back in a week because it was then that I would start what my doctors referred to as the DMT, or disease modifying therapy. They told me this was the key to slowing the progression of this chronic neurologic disabling disorder, and without it, I'd likely be in a wheelchair within 10 to 20 years. Of course, I was going to do whatever my doctors asked of me to prevent that from happening. So I returned a week later and my doctor sat me down and he said, Saray, I want you to know that although this treatment is quite effective, it's not going to be easy. This is a drug that you're going to have to inject every day. And I said, for how long? And he said, for the rest of your life. He said this is a drug that has a significant side effect profile that includes fever, chills, muscle aches and pains, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, anorexia, injection site reactions, depression, and suicidal thoughts, to name just a few. But he said, don't worry, because I know exactly what to do to reduce the likelihood that you'll experience any of those side effects. So my ears perked up. He said, you're going to do two things. First, 30 minutes before you inject the drug, you're going to pre-medicate with Tylenol or ibuprofen. And secondly, and most importantly, you're going to inject the drug right before you go to bed. This way, you'll sleep through all the side effects. Ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you that not once did I sleep through those side effects. I would inject the drug at 10 o'clock at night, and at 2 o'clock in the morning, I would awaken with violent shaking, chills, fever, et cetera, et cetera. After doing this for a couple of weeks, I didn't think I could do it much longer. So I called him to let him know that was it. I couldn't do it any longer. But before I could get a word in edgewise, he reminded me of that wheelchair. And he said, listen, discontinuing this medication is not an option, but I know exactly what we need to do. What we need to do is treat the side effects of this drug with other drugs. So when I couldn't sleep at night, I was given a prescription for Ambien. When I couldn't wake up in the morning, I was given a prescription for Provigil, an amphetamine-like drug. And when I became depressed because my life was unraveling, I was given a prescription for Prozac. By the time I was in my early 30s, I had snowballed into this chronic illness patient dependent on nearly a dozen drugs to get through a typical day. And despite all of these medications, my disease progressed and my quality of life suffered immensely. 8 years into the diagnosis, I was largely dependent on a cane or set of crutches. And to be frank, I began to lose hope. And then in 2003 came what I call my aha moment. And it came in the oddest of ways. At this point, I was chief of infectious diseases at the VA in New York. I was sitting in my office on one particular afternoon, and my secretary walked in to deliver the Daily Mail, as she would every day. But on this particular day, she dropped a large stack. It caught my attention. I looked over, and on top of the stack, I saw a journal. And on the cover of that journal, I saw the words multiple sclerosis, and of all things, blueberries. And I thought to myself, what in the world could blueberries have to do with multiple sclerosis? So I dropped everything, picked up the journal, turned to the article, and of course, what I found was an unscientific, poorly constructed study that essentially took a small group of MS patients, fed them a diet rich in blueberries, and the authors went on to conclude that this diet had resulted in patients reporting they felt better. Now, I was a scientist, a researcher. That wasn't an objective clinical endpoint. I couldn't believe anyone had published such a study. I remember having lunch with a colleague of mine that afternoon who happened to be a neurologist. I told him about what I had read, and he laughed. And so did I. But there was something about this silly little blueberry study that I couldn't get out of my head. And it wasn't that I thought eating blueberries was going to solve my problems. A much more important question surfaced from that line of thinking. For the first time in my adult life as a practicing dual board certified attending physician, I considered the following question. Could there be a connection between diet and disease? Now, if anybody could answer that question, you'd think I'd be able to, right? I was a physician, 4 years of medical school, 4 years of internal medicine residency, and then another 2 as a subspecialist. That was 10 years of my life dedicated to higher education in the field of medicine. But I couldn't think of any examples in which my professors, mentors, or educators ever connected those 2 dots. But I remained curious, maybe because I was desperate, so I decided to look into this myself. So I turned to the scientific literature looking for answers. I went to PubMed, which is our search engine, and I typed in words like multiple sclerosis and diet and chronic disease and diet. And what I got back was nothing short of remarkable. And this is one of the first studies that I came across, published in 1952 in the New England Journal of Medicine by this gentleman, Dr. Roy Swank. And in this study, Dr. Swank writes about the incidence of MS in Norway, which, by the way, has one of the highest rates of MS in the world. But as he drills down and he looks at the specifics of what's happening in Norway, he notes the following. The highest rates of MS are occurring in the inner farming dairy community, where they're consuming a lot of saturated fat. When he compares that to those that are living on the coast that are eating more fish and vegetation. So Dr. Swank in the 1950s hypothesized that somehow saturated fat was playing a role in the pathogenesis of multiple sclerosis. Now, Swank didn't just leave it at hypothesis. He actually started treating MS patients with a low-fat, plant-based diet. And he followed about 240 plus patients over 20 years and published his findings in the Annals of Neurology in 1970. But he didn't stop there. He followed them an additional 14 years and ultimately published his data in the journal The Lancet in 1990. So what did he conclude after following all these patients over 34 years? Those who adhered to the diet showed significantly less disability and lower mortality rates. Of those that survived, 95% remained physically active. Those words, 95% remained physically active, jumped off the page for me. This offered me an incredible amount of hope for the first time in a long time. And it wasn't just Swank. There were several other publications, Canadian studies, European studies, that aligned with his thinking. I was excited about this, and I was curious why it was that my doctor had never asked me about my diet. He was one of the leading experts in MS in the country. He had never asked me about other aspects that I found were also important as I read through the literature, like exercise and stress and vitamin D levels and weight. None of those questions had ever been posed or addressed when I saw my doctor. Empowered by all the literature that I had consumed, off I went to meet with him. I shared everything I had seemingly uncovered. I was so excited that this could potentially offer me some hope. Towards the end of the conversation, he looked at me somewhat disappointedly and said, Saray, do you really think that changing your diet is going to in any meaningful way change the course of this very complicated autoimmune disorder? It's not. I know it's not what you want to hear. What you need to do is remain compliant with the medications as prescribed. And if you want to blame anything for having MS, you can blame your genes, because that's why you have MS, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about that. So you might imagine, I left this visit feeling quite deflated. Whatever hope I had conjured up had been swiftly washed away, but not for long. Because I started to think more and more about my doctor's parting words, it's your genes. And it brought me back to an experience I had as an undergraduate at Rutgers University when I took a genetics course. And I remembered my professor one afternoon excitedly lecturing on monozygotic twins. And monozygotic twins are really very interesting from a geneticist perspective because you have two separate individuals that have the same genetic material, and we can learn a lot from that example. So I started to think about this question. I wondered if anyone had looked at this. If twin A has MS, what is the likelihood that twin B would have MS? In medicine, we call that concordance rates. So again, I turned to the literature looking to see if anyone had answered that question, and of course, someone had. It wasn't 100% as my doctor might have suggested. It wasn't even 50%. It was 14 to 33%. So what did this tell me? This told me that it wasn't just my genes, that there were indeed other factors that were playing a role in the evolution of this disease. So again, I turned to the scientific literature looking for answers. And that's when I came across the science of epigenetics. Epigenetics was first described in the 1950s, but really sort of flourished in the 1980s. And epigenetics essentially tells us that gene expression is dependent on outside variables. That is, that just because you have a genetic predisposition to a particular disorder doesn't necessarily mean that it will be expressed or turned on, like a light switch, like we can turn genes on or off. So what are the variables that epigenetics tell us are so important in terms of turning genes on or off? Are you ready for this? It's things like diet, exercise, smoking, stress. Sounds a lot like this idea of lifestyle medicine or preventive medicine. I love this image because it so beautifully captures the power that we have on our plates and our daily activities of life. We have this gentleman in the center of the slide, and we see his DNA. And on either side of him, two very distinct sets of decisions, right? On one side, we see an active man, the windows open, he's an outdoorsman. He's consuming a lot of whole plant-based foods, colorful foods filled with fiber and phytonutrients. On the other side, we see a couch potato. He's consuming a lot of what I call faux fake foods, right? Processed foods layered with sugar, salt, and fat of no nutritional value. The television is roaring. He's sedentary. And we can see that his decisions have resulted in very different external appearances. And we could envision what he might look like on the inside, right? What his coronary arteries might look like, for example. Of course, genes play a role, but ladies and gentlemen, don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Lifestyle matters most. Your choices matter most. At some point, I was convinced that all of this literature that I had read, that I needed to implement changes in my own life. And I knew I wasn't going to get the blessing and support that I so desperately seeked to receive from my doctor. So in 2003, I made an unconventional decision to focus on optimizing every aspect of my lifestyle and starting primarily, most importantly, with my plate. So I changed my diet to a whole foods plant-based diet. Now, why did I do that? Why did I choose a plant-based diet? Because it was popular at the time? No. Because it was trending, or the most influential celebrity had adopted a plant-based? No. I adopted a plant-based diet because the overwhelming evidence in the literature spoke to a diet rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds as being the optimal, ideal diet for all of us. I began to exercise. Believe it or not, in the 1990s, when you were diagnosed with MS, you were told not to exercise. It was falsely believed to worsen the disease. So I hadn't done anything for 8 years. The best I could do is to get onto a stationary bike, supported by my husband, and I could do a minute or two. Exhausted and in pain, he would carry me off and would take 10 to 15 minutes to recover from that. The next day I'd get back on, and the day after that, and the day after that. And over time, I started to build strength and endurance. Stress. I needed to address streams of stress in my life. So I brought my team together at the VA and I said, I'm not going to take on that extra clinic time or that extra research project. And I'm going to leave at a reasonable time every day, unless, of course, there's a patient emergency. For the first time in my life, I was going to put myself first. I learned how to sleep free of those medications on which I had become addicted to, like Ambien and Ativan. And you know what happened? It didn't happen in a week and it didn't happen in a month, but I started to feel better. At first, it was something as subtle as I could stay up past Jeopardy. On a particular day, I remember getting to my office and feeling confident enough not to use the cane on that day. I left it in the car. I'm often asked, how long did it take before you knew that the decisions you had made to optimize your lifestyle and your diet and taper off of all those medications, when did you know you had made the right decision? It's hard to say, but there is one day I remember well, and I happen to have a photograph of it, and here it is. It's about 2 years into my lifestyle change. This is July 2nd, 2005. And why do I have a photograph? On this day, I went to a wedding. My friend Tim was married on this day. And I did two things on this day that will sound trivial to you, but to me were a big deal. Two things that I didn't think I'd ever be able to do again. I wore heels and I danced with my husband. Around that time, my brother came to visit me. Now he lives in Los Angeles, so we're on opposite coast. I'm in New Jersey. I don't get to see him as often as I'd like. During this visit, he was so happy to see his sister free of the cane and sort of looking and feeling more like her old self. During this visit, he also had some good news for me. He had recently run the Los Angeles Marathon, and he proudly displayed photographs of himself at the finish line. Towards the end of that conversation, he looked at me and he said, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I think you should run a marathon. And I remember shooting him a look and angrily saying to him, I can't run a marathon. I have multiple sclerosis. I always say to my brother, it's the greatest gift he ever gave me, because saying those words out loud angrily awakened something within me. I realized in that moment that I was living my life first and foremost as this woman with MS, this doctor with MS, this mother with MS. And with that label came so many limitations, things I could do and things I couldn't. And I needed to let that go. So my brother made his way back to Los Angeles, but he had planted this seed. And without really telling anybody, I tried to do a little bit of running. It didn't go very well. My balance would be off. I'd fall, scrape my knee, but heal up and try again. There's a little nature preserve right down the street from where I live. It's called the Saray Farm. Small body of water, and there's a path around its edge. It's not very big. If you make it the entire way around, it's about 1.1 miles. The first time I made it the entire way around without falling or stopping, I felt invincible. I called my husband and I said, honey, I don't know how and I don't know when, but someday I'm going to run that marathon. And I'm happy to share that on May 2nd, 2010, I did cross the finish line at the New Jersey Marathon. And it was an extraordinary moment for me, not because I ran a marathon, but because certainly that accomplishment had shown me that these changes that I had implemented in my life had certainly borne fruit. And today, it's been 26 years since my diagnosis, and I am medication-free and disability-free and empowered more than ever before to share this very powerful healing message, this very powerful healing and simple message to whomever is willing to listen. So I thank you for the opportunity to share that with you. I told you that there were two primary reasons why I am so passionate about plant-based nutrition, about the importance of this intervention to prevent, better manage, and reverse disease. Now, I want to now talk about my professional experience. As I mentioned earlier, I began my career in the field of infectious diseases and practiced as such for many years. And in that capacity, like all physicians and healthcare professionals across the country, I managed many of these chronic diseases that we see on the CDC's leading causes of death, right? We're going to talk about COVID in a little bit, but under normal circumstances, when we're not in the midst of a pandemic, these are the leading causes of death in our country. Heart disease is number 1 and cancer number 2. Regrettably, those two alone account for nearly 50% of all deaths. We see other lifestyle-related, diet-related diseases on this list, including stroke, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes. Diabetes is a disease that is exploding in our country. When I was a medical student, rates of diabetes in the United States, about 2%. Today, we're brushing past 10%. And the CDC ominously predicts that by 2050, by the time my son is my age, 30% of Americans will be living with diabetes. I can tell you that that's not sustainable. Our healthcare system can't afford that. Let me show you what diabetes looks like when you're an infectious disease physician. So this is a common consult that I would receive at the VA hospital. This is an infected diabetic foot ulcer. And the question to me would be, Dr. Stancic, what antibiotic should this patient be placed on? And I would examine these patients and sometimes find bone involvement, which is what we call osteomyelitis. Very difficult infection to treat in anybody, but especially in diabetics. And even when we do all the right things, we put them on the right antibiotic and we debride these carefully, sometimes these patients don't get better. And they often end up like this, or even worse, an above the knee or below the knee amputation. So now we have a poorly controlled diabetic, status post amputation. Do you think they're going to sign up for a 5K? No, they're going to become more sedentary. Blood sugars further out of control. They're going to gain more weight. Blood pressure worsens, sets them up for that next catastrophic event, the heart attack or stroke. And now I'm being called in as the infectious disease physician to help manage the pneumonia that the patient has developed while intubated. This scenario that I just described to you is not unique to me. It happens every day in every hospital across our country. And no one bats an eye. It's been quite normalized. Diabetics, they develop strokes, they have heart attacks. It's expected. But to me, this is unacceptable because I know that diabetes is a disease that is largely preventable, and this scenario should be a rare event. That's not my opinion, that diabetes is largely preventable. There's a mountain of evidence in the literature that aligns with that. Let me show you a quick example of what I'm talking about. This is the Potsdam study. This was published in the Archives of Internal Medicine in 2009. Large study, 23,000 patients or participants in this study. And these investigators, this is a European study, was done in Potsdam, Germany. They wanted to learn what types of benefits might one reap if you actually engage in 4 healthy lifestyle behaviors. So what were the healthy lifestyle behaviors that these investigators wanted to know? Could they make a difference in regards to your risk of disease? First, a healthy diet, one rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lots of plants. No smoking. Smoking, of course, is the worst habit in which you can engage. Exercise. Not much, about 3.5 hours a week is what they defined as important, about 30 minutes a day. We could all do that, right? Walk for 30 minutes. And then the last habit was maintain a healthy weight. And here's what they found. Those participants who actually engaged in these 4 healthy lifestyle behaviors could expect an overall 80% reduction in chronic disease. Isn't that amazing? An 80% reduction in chronic disease. But if you drill down and you look at under that umbrella, here's what they found. 93% of diabetes was preventable just by engaging in those 4 healthy lifestyle behaviors. This is the disease I just told you is growing near exponentially in our country. And the CDC is predicting that by 2050, 30% of Americans will be living with. And we have the knowledge and understanding today in 2021 to prevent 93% of it. But we as physicians and healthcare professionals are not effectively conveying this message. 81% of heart attacks could be prevented. My goodness, 600,000 Americans die each year of a heart attack. We could save 480,000 of those lives. Strokes cut in half, and more than 1/3 of malignancies, cancers, could be prevented by modifying our behaviors. We're in trouble in our country. 1 in every 2 of us is living with at least one chronic disease. And we spend $3.6 trillion every year in healthcare in our country, and 86% of those dollars are allotted to the management of chronic diseases that we know how to largely prevent. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? I'll say it one more time. We spent $3.6 trillion, 86% of which is spent on diseases that we know how to largely prevent. Obesity rates continue to climb in our country. I don't know if you've ever seen these CDC's obesity maps. They started collecting these in 1985 when the federal government started to note that the American waist circumference was growing in the wrong direction. And they said, we better start keeping an eye on this. Every year, these maps get worse. Just when you think they're going to plateau, they can't get worse, they do. If you mix in both overweight and obese, more than 70% of Americans are either obese or overweight. That is, in our country, if you're normal weight, you're in a minority. Just to give you a sense, in the last couple of years, I'll give you this real world example of something I experienced. In late 2019, I started to write a book. And one of the first sections that I started working on was the obesity section. And so I went to the CDC's website to learn what the obesity rate was as I was writing the book. And at the time, in late 2019, the obesity rate was 39.8%. 10 months later, when I went to complete the final edits before the book went to press, I went back, checked all my facts. I went back to the CDC to confirm it was 39.8, right? No, it was now 42.4%. In 1 year, the obesity rate climbed by 2.6%, just to give you a little bit of perspective. And just a couple of months ago, and at the time, again, if you look at this slide, if you look at the dark maroon color, those are the states, regrettably, that have obesity rates greater than or equal to 35%. Those are the worst states. Just a couple of months ago, on September 15th, 2021, the CDC released this press report. We went from 12 states with obesity rates equal to or greater than 35%. We now have 16 states. Every year it gets worse. What's fueling all of this? We've known for a long time what's fueling all of this. This paper was published in 1993. These two physicians, McGinnis and Faggy, they wanted to understand, well, what is happening in our country? Why are we getting sicker and sicker and heavier? What is fueling it? So they drill down and look at a large body of data to understand what's at the root of all of this. And here's what they found in 1993. The number one contributor to premature death in our country in 1990 was smoking, which makes sense. Terrible habit, right? But it was followed closely by poor diet and sedentary behavior, right? Now, McGinnis and Faggy, these two scientists, they looked at it again 20 years later in 2010, and look what they found. Diet had now surpassed tobacco as the number one cause of death, and that's where we are today. The leading cause or contributor to premature death in our country is our diet. We are literally killing ourselves with our forks. Such an important statement that it merits its own slide. Diet is the most important factor contributing to premature death. And yet, we've known this for some time because remember I told you in 1985, the CDC started to collect data on this because they saw that the American waist circumference was growing. They also realized that doctors better start talking about our nutrition because it's a big factor in the development of disease. So in 1985, the National Academies of Science actually surveyed medical schools across the country to make sure that nutrition education was an important part of what they were teaching doctors. But here's what they found in 1985. Nutrition education programs in U.S. medical schools are largely inadequate to meet the present and future demands of the medical profession. Doctors don't learn anything about nutrition. Even today, this is where we are. We don't learn anything about nutrition, and yet it is the number one contributing factor to premature death in our country. Isn't that crazy? The misalignment there. Why? It's largely because we're still teaching doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals under this antiquated medical education model. So what I say to my students, my medical students, is that you're going to learn how to become a really good disease detective in medical school, right? We teach under this idea of pathogenesis, which is the mechanism by which disease is caused. So in medical school, we learn how to take really good histories and physical exams, and then we do things like collect blood samples and do imaging studies, all in an effort to create that differential diagnosis, right? And once we have a diagnosis, our treatment plan includes a pharmaceutical agent, a pill, a surgical intervention, or a procedure. And all of that is important, but it's only half of the story. In medical school, we only learn half of the human health continuum. What we don't learn is the opposite of pathogenesis, which is a term called salutogenesis, the process through which health and well-being are produced. We don't learn anything about that in medical school. And what would that mean? It would mean modules on nutrition primarily, exercise, sleep, mindfulness, self-care. Doctors don't know how to take care of themselves. Do you know that doctors have one of the highest rates of suicide of any profession, which is incongruent with what we do? We represent health in our community and we're not taking care of ourselves. We need to usher in this new era of salutogenesis in healthcare. We need to reimagine the healthcare delivery system, create a shift in paradigm and culture, connect the dots between the importance of food and health outcomes. The average individual doesn't understand the importance of what they place on their plate and how it affects their risk of disease as they age. Why is now the right time? I mean, we've known this for some time. I told you in 1985, the CDC was well aware that our dietary choices were putting us on the wrong path. But I think now might be a very good time for us to change, or there might be a sense that we need to change. And the reason I say that is because the entire country, the entire globe we have their attention, right, on one singular topic. And of course, I'm talking about the pandemic. The pandemic in our country, the first case was diagnosed in January of 2020. So it's going to be almost 2 years. And a businessman that returned from Wuhan, China to Washington State. And you don't need me to recount all of the pain and suffering that we have witnessed over the past near 2 years. But how is the acute coronavirus pandemic, intersected with the chronic disease epidemic, largely fueled by our poor diets? And how it's intersected, we learned this very, very early on in June of 2020, when the CDC offered us this report. They told us that if you had a pre-existing illness like heart disease or diabetes or obesity at the time that you were infected with SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, you were 6 times more likely to be hospitalized and 12 times more likely to die. We know that the leading risk factors for death are obesity, diabetes, heart disease, hypertension. These are all diet, lifestyle-related diseases. It is my hope that the silver lining of this very difficult period for us is that we realize that we have to change, that this results in a call to action within the healthcare system, within my peers, other physicians and other healthcare professionals like nurses and registered dietitians, that we need to come together and create a meaningful shift in our healthcare system. We need to communicate these messages to patients across the country and beyond. Now, I realize that what I'm asking is not easy. It's going to be challenging. There's a lot of obstacles to creating change. People are not always welcoming to change. And to be frank, the status quo, the healthcare system as it is financially sound. So how do we create incentives for meaningful change? Well, we've done hard things in the past in healthcare. I'll give you an example: smoking. Believe it or not, a long time ago, doctors actually used to recommend smoking, but we learned and we understood and we created change, right? In 1964, the Surgeon General produced a report that enumerated all the reasons why we shouldn't be smoking. In 1964, 42% of American adults smoked. Today, we're down to 14%. And believe me, we got there through a lot of hard work, right? A lot of difficult public health messaging. But the biggest change occurred in 1993. And you know what happened in 1993? And this is almost shameful. It wasn't until 1993 that hospitals were required to remove smoking altogether. It was required by the Joint Commission. And in 1993, when all hospitals went smoke-free, this signaled to, at the time, President Bill Clinton, who said, hospitals don't allow smoking. Let's not allow smoking in federal buildings, which is sort of common sense, right? And then governors followed suit and they said no smoking in state houses, and then local municipalities. And then schools said no smoking, and churches said no smoking, and then restaurants, no smoking, and bars, no smoking. And all of a sudden, we created a shift in culture and paradigm. So smoking was no longer hip and cool and acceptable. It was today not really the hippest and coolest behavior in which to engage. We created a shift in paradigm. And I think that's where we are today with food. We need to shed light on the importance of what we're placing on our plates and helping individuals to understand and connect the dots between their choices and the risk of diabetes down the line, or heart disease, or breast cancer, or prostate cancer, so that we can make better decisions, so that we can all age gracefully. My hope for each and every one of us is that on our last day on planet Earth at age 102, I pray, that we're surrounded by our family and friends and we enjoy a beautiful day free of dementia, and then we go to bed and pass away peacefully. That there isn't that bookend of life where we're suffering. We're in a nursing home, demented, or suffering. We all have the capacity to do that, and we can increase our likelihood of ending our lives in that fashion by engaging in optimal lifestyle choices, primarily and most importantly, our dietary choices. I want to end by sharing this example that I'm so proud of. I'm going to ask each and every one of you to create some positive change in you, not only for yourself, but also in your part of the world. When I was a young medical student, for some odd reason, the administrators at University Hospital, which is the hospital that is affiliated with our medical school in Newark, New Jersey, they decided to place a Burger King within the four walls of the hospital. And it was really quite upsetting because having a fast food restaurant within the four walls of a tertiary care center just doesn't make sense, right? Like, it doesn't make sense that we smoke in the hospital either. It's bad enough that the hospital itself is surrounded, if you cross the street, with fast food restaurants, but something about putting it inside, to me, felt wrong. And I brought attention to this. I emailed board members and the CEO of the hospital, and I tried to meet with local politicians and write to our senators. It was largely ignored. And then in 2015, I reached out to my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Neil Barnard at PCRM. And I said, I need your help, because I had been unable to get a copy of the contract. They kept telling me that the contract could never be broken. And Dr. Barnard helped me retrieve a copy of that contract. And we learned that the Burger King contract was up for renewal in 2020. And that positioned us to act. So I started a petition. We collected thousands of signatures and extraordinary comments from people from all over the country. We held a protest in front of the hospital, speaking to the importance of fast foods and how they fuel the very chronic diseases that we're seeing in hospitalized patients with heart attacks and complications of diabetes. And the wonderful news is that the CEO of the hospital was inspired by our advocacy and realized that the Burger King needed to go, and he decided not to renew the contract. Now, it wasn't, believe it or not, it wasn't a popular decision, but he did it nonetheless, because he knew at the end of the day, it was the right thing to do. Believe it or not, we still have a lot of work to do, because 63% of medical schools are affiliated with hospitals that house a fast food restaurant. So we still have a lot of work to do. Finally, my last slide, a quote that I love from Maya Angelou: do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your attention. I think we have a few minutes, and I'm happy to take questions.
Okay,
Mike,
Dr.
I don't know if you're,
Yeah, can you hear me now? Sorry, I just had to
I can.
You can, very
I
good.
can hear you.
Okay, Dr. Harrington's here. He's actually gonna get a little dialogue. There's a guy, yeah, you see him in the camera there?
Yes, I heard the end of your presentation was fantastic.
Oh, thank you. Okay, well, here, I'll give you the microphone. Come on this side. Gerard, is that, I think you might, do you know Gerard from Hippocrates? But anyway, he has MS as well, so he's right here with us. I want
Okay.
Dr. Harrington to take over and get a little dialogue going maybe between the two of you and some questions.
Okay, yes. First off, I'm totally honored to be here and to be having a dialogue here with you today. And I have had several patients with multiple sclerosis, and of course, the nutritional aspect is the #1 recommendation. And we can have a forum here. We can have questions, and here we are. We have experts, doctors, patients who've lived it. If we have any questions, I guess from the crowd, is that where we could start, or would you like to have lead it off with your experiences as a patient?
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? All right, great. Thank you for coming. I appreciate being here. I live to and I love to share my story. Much like the doctor here, that's what we do. We share our story, and many people know that, hey, there is a better way. 1986, I was told I had multiple sclerosis, chronic degenerative neurological disorder. I was told I'll probably be in a wheelchair by the time I'm 40, I'll be dead by the time I'm 50. I said, yo, doc, I'm just starting my life. I'm just going to get married here. What's up with that? Similar to Dr. Stancic, I tried all the MS pharmaceuticals, or as I like to call them, pharmacopicals. Now, that stuff didn't work. Luckily, when I got 20 years asymptomatic, 2006, the stuff hit the fan really hard. In less than 8 months flat, I went from limp, cane, walker, scooter. Then I found myself in a scooter trying all these MS drugs. That stuff didn't work. Luckily, I got off of that stuff rather quickly. There was a question that was asked already about this. Very simple. When I got off of the drugs, it took a solid 1.5 years of my body detoxing from all that crap, as well as the MS rearing its ugly head. Once I got off of that, I made the brilliant discovery. Gee, if the same diet and lifestyle that I've had got me sick, I'm going to take a different action here. I changed my action. I said not to be a couch potato, but I have to do some physical therapy. Also encouraged me that diet, like again what the doctor was talking about, diet plays a huge part. Better to change my diet. I went vegan. When I went vegan, in less than 2 months, my body went through a big change. That was another question. What happened? Go vegan, folks. Your body will love you for it. You go through a bit of a detox, your body wants all the crap that you're used to having. Go through the detox. Once you're through it, you'll never go back. Go vegan. It's something very, very special, ethically as well as karmically, about not harming animals. Once I went vegan, then a year later I went raw vegan. I'm going to pop yourself into right down the road here, right? I've been a vegan now for 9 years. I've been 8 years raw. In 4 months, I'm going to be 65 years old. In May, I was diagnosed in 86, and 35 years ago. People don't listen to say the words, I've been diagnosed 35 years ago. In 4 months, I'll be 65. Again, another miracle. Third miracle, on land, I'm now walking 225 feet. Feel free to clap on that one, man. Very special stuff, all by going raw vegan and saying no to pharmaceuticals, no to drugs. Please, you have a real person in front of you, and a person right there on video, as well as a doctor here. Questions, what do you want to know? Hit us with questions here.
Do we have any questions? So I've been friends with Gerard on Facebook for quite some time, and I'm very excited to meet him in person today. And I've known about his story for quite some time. And I have a good friend who also has MS, and she was a longtime vegetarian, and it wasn't until switching over to a vegan lifestyle for the animals and consequently a plant-based diet that she also had such incredible health benefits. Can we get any questions from the audience?
I'll share something else. It came up a few minutes ago about eating animals and about heart disease. The second leading cause of death right now, according to Dr. Michael Greger, is heart disease. Heart disease, by far and away, 90 to 95% of all heart disease is caused by high cholesterol. Cholesterol only comes from eating animals. Cholesterol is not found in plants. I have a great idea, folks. Don't eat animals, eat plants. Don't get heart disease. Don't get dropped dead. Think about that stuff. I got lots more, but we keep going.
Hey, I thought I'd ask Dr. Stancic a question. Dr. Stancic, have you, one of the things that I recommend to people is to start simply. So, you know, I don't eat a lot of recipes with a million different, I don't eat a lot of foods with recipes that are very complicated and everything. I'm pretty simple, and it's kind of served me well. So I was just going to ask, do you have any tips or tricks or things like that for in the kitchen, or any kind of cooking things or utensils or something that you might like to tell people that can help make it easier for them?
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. The idea is to increase, and it's important, as you know, that we meet patients where they are. Obviously, we want patients to be 100% plant-based, but often it's such a significant lifestyle change that we may begin by asking them just to include more plants on their plate, and it's important to also take a food diary and see where they are and how can you take some of their favorite meals and make them healthier options. But I think the approach that you have is really ideal, because we want to make it as simple as possible and accessible to all people.
Great, thank you so much. I just once again really appreciate that your feedback, and I'm honored to be here. And you know, when I first became plant-based, my vegan superhero story was that I'm in the Army trying to lose weight because the Army makes me run all the time. And I wanted to get I was gaining weight. Here I was 35 and I was 15 to 20 pounds heavier. And so I tried to go on a standard American diet and just eat smaller portions and exercise more to see if I could lose weight, and I failed miserably. And so I got depressed. As a family doctor, I got depressed. I thought, oh man, I'll never be able to do it. And that's when I saw forks over knives, and I changed my diet to a plant-based diet. And so since then, all my medical problems improved. And since then, I've just seen so many improvements on, all these different diseases. And when you're dealing with a disease like multiple sclerosis, it's just so impressive. And so if this doesn't impress you about the power of the plant-based diet, nothing will really, because this is very impressive. It looks like we do have a question. Do we have enough time, folks?
About 30 seconds.
Yeah, 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay, between us, 30 seconds. Uh-oh, I'm kind of long-winded. What do we got, sir?
Will's ready?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Don't worry about it.
Doctor, what I wanted to mention to you was not a question, it's a statement. When I came here today, there's a couple of hundred people walking around. And as I was walking over to hear your talk, the first thing I said to my wife was, there aren't any fat people here. So when you talk about proof is in the pudding, just take a look around.
Thank you. All right, we're gonna wrap it up.
I guess I can make a comment. Yes, we are very lucky. When you go on a plant-based diet in low calorie density, you get to eat, and I love to eat, but you get to eat a lot of food and feel satisfied and continue to lose weight. So that is the power of the plant-based diet. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that the reason Dr. Stancic and myself made the change that we did, we had a choice to change or drop dead. It's very simple. But that is your choice. You do what you got to do. My question for people that are not vegan, but think about it, is tomorrow guaranteed for you? If not, go vegan. Live your life as if your life depends upon it there.
All right, thank you so much to Gerard, Dr. Harrington, and our keynote speaker, Dr. Stancic. Thank you all so much. We have another keynote speaker about to start, and this is a friend of ours, Dr. Will Tuttle, author of the world